There are conversations that don't change because there is a lack of arguments, but because something inside us arrives in tension beforehand. Even before the first word, the body closes, the mind arms itself, and the heart prepares to resist. In this invisible moment, the course of everything begins to be decided, not because of what will be said, but because of the inner state of the speaker and the listener. Think about how many times you entered a conversation feeling like you needed to defend yourself, explain, prove, or win. Even when the words seem right, something gets lost along the way. The other closes, the voice hardens, the space between you becomes heavy. In the end, the impression is left that no one really came out of that exchange in one piece. In nature, things don't work like that. A river does not face a rock with force. It wraps around it, goes around it, and moves on. The wind does not argue with the mountain. It learns its relief and changes direction. Nothing tries to dominate. Everything tries to adjust, find passage, preserve the flow. There is a quiet intelligence in this, a wisdom that does not need to impose itself to exist. Human conversations, however, often ignore this rhythm. We speak too quickly. We react before listening, and we respond before understanding. We create battles where there could be bridges, and we often do this without realizing it, just repeating old patterns of defense and affirmation. There is, however, an almost imperceptible turning point, a small verbal gesture that comes from a calmer place, a simple combination of words that does not try to defeat the other, but to recognize it. When it appears, something immediately changes in the atmosphere of the conversation. The tension decreases, silence gains space, and dialogue stops being a confrontation and becomes an encounter. This combination does not work as a technique. It is not effective because it is smart, but because it is accompanied by a different internal disposition. It only transforms when it is said from a place of humility, presence, and real listening. When this happens, the other person feels it, not rationally, but bodily. The shoulders relax, the tone of voice changes, the rigidity begins to give way. This video is not about convincing anyone. It's about remembering an inner state that makes any conversation more human. If you feel that many discussions arise even before listening, if you notice that silence is absent, from your dialogues, this is an invitation to slow down. Stay here for a few minutes. Breathe. Observe, because sometimes you don't need to change someone else. Just change the place where the words come from. And when that happens, a simple combination of words is enough to completely change the course of any conversation. Every conversation carries an energy even before any sentence is formed. It is born in the body, passes through breathing, and only then reaches the mouth. When this energy is agitated, words come out loaded with tension even if they are polite. The other notices, not because of the content, but because of the invisible tone that accompanies them. It is at this point that the confrontation begins, often without anyone having the conscious intention of fighting. Silence is often seen as absence, as a lack of response or weakness. But there is a kind of silence that is not empty. He is full of attention. It is the silence that you observe before reacting, that creates space between the stimulus and the response. When this silence is present, the conversation changes in nature. It stops being automatic and becomes intentional. Most verbal conflicts arise because we respond too quickly. We don't listen to understand. We listen only to prepare the next speech. In this movement, the conversation becomes a game of forces. Each sentence tries to push the other. Each argument becomes a thrown stone. The flow stops. There is a simple combination of words that arises, precisely from this previous silence. It does not come to end the dialogue, but to slow it down. It doesn't come to prove a point, but to recognize the other's space. When said with presence, it disarms the impulse to attack. The confrontation loses support because it finds no resistance. In nature, still water reflects the sky clearly. Choppy water distorts everything it touches. The same goes for conversations. When the mind is in excessive movement, any word from another seems like a threat. When the mind slows down, even disagreement can be welcomed without tension. This word or small phrase functions as a lively pause within the dialogue. It signals that there is no rush to win, that there is no need to defend yourself immediately, that there is space to listen without reacting. Often, the simple act of recognizing what the other person feels completely changes the direction of the conversation. It is important to understand that this does not mean agreeing with everything, nor canceling yourself out. It just means not turning every exchange into a battlefield. It means allowing dialogue to exist without the obligation to reach a winner. When this posture appears, something curious happens, and the other also relaxes. Aggressiveness loses its function. The conversation finds a more human rhythm. In modern everyday life, this seems almost counterintuitive. We are trained to respond quickly, give our opinion on everything, and position ourselves at all times. Silence, in this context, sounds strange, but it is precisely he who gives depth to the words. Without silence, all speech becomes noise. The combination of words that silences confrontation has no power in itself. It only works when it is accompanied by this internal pause, when it appears as an extension of a calmer state, and not as a strategy. In this case, she does not interrupt the dialogue. She realigns it. Maybe you've already experienced this without realizing it. A conversation that seemed to be heading towards conflict, but that changed direction after a simple sentence said honestly and calmly. It wasn't the content that transformed everything. It was the silence that came before her. In the next block, we will look deeper into this inner state and understand why internal purification is the true preparation for any word that wishes to harmonize, not hurt. Before any words leave your mouth, something has already happened inside. A silent, almost automatic reaction that mixes memory, emotion, and expectation. Many answers are not born from the present but from old accumulations. Unresolved resentments, fears of not being heard, need for control. When we speak from this place, the conversation carries invisible impurities. Even correct sentences arrive blurred to the other person. Therefore, it is not enough to choose your words well. It is necessary to observe the internal state from which they arise. Purity, in this context, has no relation to morality or perfection. It refers to clarity, to a state in which the mind is not taken over by reactive impulses. When this clarity is absent, the response becomes defense. When it is present, the response becomes care. In everyday life, we rarely take this break. We answer messages when we are angry. We argue when we are tired. We explain when we are hurt. We hope that dialogue will resolve what is, in fact, still confused within us. The result is predictable. The conversation becomes more complicated. The tone rises. Understanding moves away. Inner purification begins with a simple gesture, recognizing one's own state before responding. Notice if there is a rush, tension, or desire to impose something. This recognition does not require judgment, just honesty. By internally naming what is present, we already create a small distance between the impulse and the action. This distance is essential. In nature, cloudy water does not reflect anything clearly. When it rests, the particles slowly descend and transparency returns. The same happens with the mind. When we allow a brief rest before responding, emotions settle. They don't disappear, but they stop commanding. The word that comes after this carries another quality. Many difficult conversations don't require quick answers. They need clean answers. Clean's not in the sense of smooth, but in the sense of aligned. A clean response can be firm, but not aggressive. It can be clear without being harsh. She doesn't try to unload what's accumulated. It expresses only what is necessary. This internal preparation is especially important in times of constant communication. Social media, instant messaging, and public debates encourage immediate reaction. The faster you respond, the more value there appears to be. Little is said about the cost of this. Constant reactivity contaminates dialogue and normalizes aggression. When someone speaks from a purified state, something changes in the field of conversation. Not because the person becomes superior, but because they don't add more noise. She doesn't add more weight to what is already heavy. This creates a sense of security in each other, even in disagreements. Dialogue finds ground. The combination of words that transform conversations only works when it goes through this internal process. Without it, the sentence becomes an empty technique. With him, even few words carry truth. The other realizes when there is no ulterior motive, when there is no hidden desire to win or manipulate. Purifying yourself before responding is a silent gesture of responsibility. It is recognizing that the quality of the conversation begins within, and not with the other. We can't always do that, but when we succeed, we realize that many discussions lose steam before they even begin. In the next block, we will go a step further and observe how true transformation happens when we abandon the idea of winning a conversation and start looking for something more subtle, restoring flow and harmony between two paths that meet. Most difficult conversations turn into conflict because they are treated as disputes. Even when there is no explicit intention to win, there is a silent impulse to be right, to support one's position and not give way. This impulse shapes the tone, posture, and there are pauses. The conversation stops being a meeting and becomes a negotiation of power. From an early age, we learn that giving in is losing, that changing your mind is a sign of weakness, that a successful conversation is one in which the other person agrees with us. This logic, when taken into everyday dialogue, creates constant tension. Each sentence becomes a strategic move, each answer an attempt at advantage. In this scenario, harmony has no space to emerge. In nature, there is no idea of victory. A river does not overcome the bank. A tree cannot overcome the wind. They coexist by continually adjusting. When they encounter resistance, they do not advance with unnecessary force. Find another way. This intelligence is not passive, but profoundly efficient. It preserves movement without creating disruption. Applying this principle to human conversations requires a subtle but profound internal shift. It means letting go of the need to come out on top and making a commitment to maintaining the flow. Instead of asking, "How can I convince?" attention shifts to, "How can I sustain dialogue?" This change completely alters the quality of the exchange. Seeking harmony is not about avoiding conflicts at any cost. Conflicts exist and are part of the encounter between differences. The question is how we position ourselves in front of them. When the intention is to win, the conflict intensifies. When the intention is to harmonize, conflict becomes a point of adjustment, not a point of rupture. There are times when disagreement is necessary, but disagreeing doesn't have to mean attacking. A conversation can contain opposing positions without becoming hostile. This is only possible when neither party is trying to dominate the other, when the focus stops being the final result and becomes the quality of the path. The word combination that transforms conversations operates exactly at this point. She does not try to end the discussion or impose a solution. It signals a willingness to walk together, even in differences. When said with this intention, it interrupts the play of forces. The other realizes that he is not facing an adversary, but someone willing to maintain the bond. This gesture has an immediate effect. The rigidity decreases because there is no longer a threat. The conversation slows down because there is no urgency to win. Often, simply recognizing another person's perspective is enough to restore flow. Not because everything is resolved, but because the dialogue stops being defensive. In the middle of this journey, a silent invitation is worth it. If this idea of talking without seeking victory resonates with you, it is a sign that something has already begun to reorganize internally. It's not about adopting a new technique, but about realizing a deeper desire for less exhausting and more true relationships. In today's world, where opinions clash all the time, choosing harmony seems almost an act of resistance. But it is precisely this choice that returns humanity to conversations. It does not eliminate differences, but creates space for them to exist without destruction. In the next block, we will delve even deeper into this experience and observe how the presence of the invisible, what is not said but felt, directly influences the direction of any dialogue when there is real listening and mutual respect. Every conversation happens on two levels at the same time. There is the visible level, formed by words, arguments, and responses, and there is an invisible, silent level where each person's intention, attention, and inner disposition are found. This second level is almost never named, but it is what determines whether the dialogue moves closer to or away from conflict. When someone speaks without being truly present, the other feels it. It doesn't matter how logical or well-constructed the speech is. Something sounds empty, mechanical, distant. Likewise, when someone listens only to respond and not to understand, the conversation loses depth. The invisible retracts. The meeting does not happen. There is a listening that goes beyond the ear. She is not limited to the words spoken, but notices pauses, hesitations, changes in tone. She recognizes that behind many harsh words there is insecurity, tiredness, or fear. When this listening is present, the conversation gains another density. The other feels seen, even when there is no agreement. In nature, the entire forest seems to listen, not in the human sense, but as an attentive field. The sound spreads, is absorbed, returned in another form. Nothing reacts in isolation. Everything participates. Human conversations also work best when there is this sense of shared ground where no one is talking alone. The invisible one who listens does not judge. He just welcomes what comes up. When we enter a conversation with this stance, we stop trying to control the direction of the dialogue. We started to follow. This does not mean passivity, but openness. An opening that allows the dialogue to reveal itself little by little, without rushing to conclusion. Many conflicts intensify because each person feels that needs to be heard, but no one is willing to listen. It's as if two voices were speaking at the same time, competing for space. When someone takes on deep listening, something reorganizes. The urgency decreases. The tone changes. The other, realizing this, tends to lower their defenses. The combination of words that transform conversations only finds effect when this invisible is active. Otherwise, it becomes just a polite phrase with no real impact. When spoken from presence, however, it carries a different weight. Not an imposed weight, but a real one. The other feels that he is not being manipulated or led, just found. Listening in this way takes courage, because truly listening involves giving up temporary certainties. It involves accepting that the other person can touch something sensitive. It involves remaining open even when discomfort arises. But it is precisely this risk that makes dialogue alive. In today's fast-paced daily life, this deep listening seems rare. We are interrupted all the time by notifications, thoughts, and expectations. Still, it remains possible. Sometimes all it takes is one person to take on this role for the entire conversation to change direction. The invisible responds quickly to genuine presence. When this happens, dialogue is no longer just an exchange of information. It becomes a space for transformation, not because one teaches the other something, but because both are touched by a more subtle level of encounter. Something falls into place internally, even if no clear conclusion is reached. In the next block, we will get closer to the most delicate point of this journey. It is there that the combination of words finally reveals itself, not as a formula, but as a gesture, a simple, almost invisible gesture that works like a silent portal, capable of transforming the direction of any conversation when it comes from the right place. After everything that has been observed so far, it becomes clear that transforming a conversation does not depend on eloquence, persuasion, or forced emotional control. It depends on internal alignment. The combination of words that changes the direction of a dialogue is not powerful because it is special, rare, or complex. It is powerful because it appears at the right time, from a clean, silent, and attentive place. This combination is not an argument. It's not a long explanation or an attempt to convince. On the contrary, it is usually short, sometimes too simple to seem meaningful. What differentiates it is not in the structure of the sentence, but in the gesture it carries. A gesture of recognition, openness, and non-opposition. When a conversation reaches a point of tension, there is usually an invisible fork. On the one hand, the continuity of the clash. On the other, the possibility of redirection. Most people automatically take the first path because it is the most familiar. The combination of words appears as a conscious choice for the second path. It often takes forms such as an honest acknowledgement of the other person's point, an admission of not knowing everything, or a verbal pause that gives space back to the dialogue. It's not about giving in for the sake of giving in, but about signaling that the conversation doesn't need to escalate to continue existing. This signal is noticed immediately. The effect of this is almost always the same. The pace slows down. The need to defend oneself diminishes. The other, who until then was prepared for the confrontation, loses the attack momentum, not because he was logically disarmed, but because he no longer felt threatened. The conversation finds another axis. It is important to understand that this combination cannot be used as a mechanical tool. When someone tries to apply it as a strategy, it loses strength. The other perceives the hidden intention. The gesture is no longer genuine. Therefore, it only works when it is born from real listening and a sincere desire to maintain the bond above victory. In many cases, this combination comes down to taking responsibility for one's internal state. Something like recognizing your own limit, your own lack of knowledge, or even your own mistake. This requires vulnerability, but it is precisely this vulnerability that breaks the logic of confrontation. It introduces humanity where before there were only positions. In today's world, admitting limits seems risky. There is a belief that showing doubt weakens. However, in deep conversations, the opposite happens. When someone shows themselves to be human, others tend to respond in the same way. The dialogue is balanced. Exchange becomes possible. The combination that transforms does not resolve all conflicts. It does not always lead to immediate agreements, but it prevents the conversation from deteriorating. It preserves something essential, the possibility of continuity. Even when dialogue ends without consensus, it does not end in rupture. This is perhaps its greatest strength. Instead of seeking a quick outcome, she protects the field of the relationship, allows understanding to mature over time. Some conversations only find clarity later, and this is only possible when the wine cooler is not destroyed in the process. When used from the right place, this combination does not stand out. She doesn't draw attention to herself. It often goes unnoticed on a conscious level, but its effects are felt. The conversation takes a different direction. The climate changes. Something silently reorganizes itself. In the next and final block, we will bring together all these threads and end this journey with a broader reflection, a return to the silence where it all began, and an invitation to continue walking, attentive to those small, invisible gestures that, without making a sound, profoundly transform the way we find ourselves through words. Throughout this journey, it became clear that conversations are not transformed just by what is said, but by the inner space from which the words emerge. Before the right sentence, there is a disposition. Before understanding, there is presence. And before any attempt to resolve, convince, or explain, there is the possibility of simply being whole in front of the other. Many dialogues fail not because people disagree, but because they are too loaded with haste, defenses, unresolved stories. They hope that the conversation heals something that has not yet been accepted internally. When this happens, no combination of words is enough. Noise has already taken the place of listening. But when there is a pause, when there is internal silence, when there is a willingness not to win, something changes. Conversation stops being an instrument of affirmation and becomes a space for meeting. Even if the disagreement remains, it no longer hurts in the same way. The bond does not break. The flow continues. The combination of words that runs throughout this video is neither a hidden secret nor a mystical formula. It is simple because it is born from a simple gesture, recognizing the other without abandoning oneself. Recognize yourself without closing yourself off. This balance is rare, but profoundly transformative. In the world we live in, where everything requires an immediate response and constant positioning, choosing this path requires attention. It requires slowing down when everything pushes you into a hurry. It requires listening when the impulse is to react. It requires humility to admit that not every conversation needs an immediate conclusion. When this gesture becomes part of the way of being in the world, something is reorganized not only in the dialogues, but in the relationships as a whole. Exchanges become less stressful. Conflicts lose their destructive character. Communication stops being a testing ground and becomes a space for continuous construction. Perhaps from now on, you will begin to perceive these moments more clearly. The exact moment in which you could react, but choose to breathe. The phrase that could harden the conversation, but is replaced by another that opens up space. The silence that appears not as an escape, but as care. These small, almost invisible gestures are what transform the most. If this content resonates with you, it's a sign that something is already in motion. It is not a new idea that is being installed, but a recognition, a reminder that there is another way of relating to others, less based on control and more based on harmony. If you want to continue walking through this type of reflection, Deepening this look at the human and the invisible that crosses us, subscribe to the channel and follow us. Here, the intention is not to offer ready-made answers, but to create spaces where questions can mature in silence. Because in the end, perhaps what we call dialogue is just a form of shared listening, and perhaps what we call conflict is just a mismatch of rhythms. When we learn to listen to the right timing of words, something bigger begins to reveal itself. What if what we call destiny is not a fixed line ahead, but just the constant whisper of invisible forces trying to guide us back to balance? Perhaps they are also present in the simplest conversations, just waiting for us to choose to listen.